Welcome, everyone. This is a panel discussion of the topic of real-world evidence in the context of uncertainty, and we'll be using the approval of aducanumab and future approval of other monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease as a case study, but the general topic will be more broadly on the issues and challenges of market access decisions in the context of uncertainty, particularly with the expedited pathways and accelerated approval. My name is Sean Tunis, and I work with Russ Paulson and others at Us Against Alzheimer's. I'm a consultant with Rubik's Health and a senior fellow at the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at Tufts Medical Center. And I also work as a mentor in residence at Johns Hopkins in their technology incubator. So today with us, we have a fantastic panel to discuss the topic. And we'll start with introductions of the panelists. And I'd like to go first to Nicholas Hedberg.
Thank you, Sean, and hello to everyone. So my name is Nicholas Hedberg. I am the chief pharmacist at TLV. That would be the Swedish Pricing and Reimbursement Agency. We make reimbursement decisions for outpatient pharmaceuticals, and we do HTA-based reports for the use in the regions on in-hospital care drugs and some medical devices. I'm also the chair of a European network of HTA agencies called UNETA 21, now working for 2 years. And I have spent quite a lot of my working time on this individual disease area, Alzheimer's disease, since I came into my new position, and at the moment I was surprised by the amount of Alzheimer's, but it's interesting to be in this panel. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Good, thanks, Nicholas. Brian, you're next.
Thank you, Sean, and everybody. I'm Brian O'Rourke from Canada. I was the president and chief executive officer of CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. Canada's HTA agency, with funding from our federal government in Canada, as well as all of the provinces and territories. So I served as its president from 2009 until I retired in 2020. Right now, I'm kind of in a semi-retired or independent healthcare advisor mode. I do some volunteer work with ISPOR. I chair their HTA Council. And with the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences, I chair their HTA Steering Committee. I've been involved with the international HTA community for a number of years. And I do some paid consulting work since I retired from CADTH. I'm doing some advisory work with a company called EQRX out of Boston and Pharma CCX out of Switzerland, and working on a project with Roche Pharmaceuticals on precision oncology at the moment. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Brian, for joining us. Steve.
Yeah, Sean, thanks for having me. So my name's Steve Miller. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Clinical Officer at Cigna. We're a global healthcare company in 30 different countries. Importantly for today, I represent about 80 million people through our pharmacy benefits management solution. I also have about 16 million clients in our covered medical lives. And then I've historically been very interested in Alzheimer's. I've served on the board of the Blue Field Project at the University of California, San Francisco to find a cure for a genetic linked cause of Alzheimer's. And then locally, I serve on the board of Memory Care Home Solutions, which tries to help families keep Alzheimer's patients in their home, out of clinics, hospitals, and doctors' offices, by serving mostly the caretakers of the patients who have Alzheimer's. So thanks for having me.
Excellent, Steve, thanks. And Wendy, you're next.
Hi, thank you, Sean. Wendy Sanhai. I'm currently with Deloitte, where I serve clients across the federal government, including FDA, NIH, and CMS, as well as our commercial clients in industry across the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical devices. I first joined FDA in 2001, so I've spent the last 20 years or so either working for them or with them in some capacity. Even now in my current role at Deloitte, I've been contracted back to lead an initiative in oncology whereby we're looking at updating the labeling for oncology drugs that are currently on the market with more pertinent and updated information. The last 7 years of my time at FDA, I was a senior scientific advisor to the commissioner's office, and I left FDA and joined industry as a senior director for GSK in global regulatory affairs. I also have two academic positions, one an associate professor adjunct at Duke University, the School of Medicine, and also a senior executive fellow at the University of Maryland. I also chair the board at the business school at Maryland. And I'm also on the board for Medicines for Malaria Ventures, and very happy to be here. Perhaps if I can add, this topic that we're going to be discussing today is of personal interest to me because my father passed away from this disease. And so as a caretaker, I saw that every single day he lived with me, and it was quite devastating, as many of you might know who have family members and loved ones suffering from this disease. I've worked in this area now for over 17 years and thrilled that for the first time in 17 years, we do have a disease modifying treatment on the market with more in the pipeline. So thrilled for other families who are dealing with this disease. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Wendy. And so I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes just to kind of, set up the topic and some of the key issues we're going to be discussing today. And then we'll start to have kind of a roundtable conversation. So the first point, picking up, Wendy, on your introduction, the last part of your introduction, as virtually everyone knows, the approval of aducanumab for Alzheimer's disease, particularly mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's, by the FDA in June, was met with tremendous excitement on behalf of the patient community and the patient advocacy community. I think it was noted multiple times that the last product that had been approved for dementia or Alzheimer's was 17 years prior to that. So an enormous amount of excitement about the potential and finally having a therapy that offered some hope. At the same time, it triggered an enormous amount of debate and concern and controversy related to whether the evidence that was available from the trials was sufficient for the approval. There was a lot of discussion about the use of surrogate endpoints and how well they are predictive of clinical benefit, and kind of brought to the surface in a very prominent way the general issue of drugs that go through a regulatory process through an expedited pathway, particularly accelerated approval, with perhaps less mature evidence than has traditionally been available to payers and health technology assessment organizations, and recognizing that there's a substantial amount of uncertainty that is present in that context. And so this has then led to a lot of thinking and writing and investigation into this whole expedited approval pathway, particularly how it could be dealt with from a market access, reimbursement, health technology assessment perspective. So I just want to get some reactions from the panel to just the way that is framed, or any nuances about kind of what I missed or what needs to be emphasized, just in terms of a kind of a description of the problem that the problem or the challenges presented. And I wonder if it's okay. We'll start with Wendy, but then if anyone who wants to make a comment, I'll either call on you or just kind of put your hand up, and we'll call you out.
Thanks, Sean. Those are very good points, and I'm glad you're opening today's panel session with exactly what you've just articulated. I also want to make clear that, the accelerated, any one of the four accelerated approval pathways or review pathways that FDA uses, whether it's accelerated approval or fast track, priority review, or the most recent breakthrough therapy designation, which is not an approval, just so that it's clear to the audience, does not equate to FDA accepting subpar evidence, on which to base their efficacy and safety decisions. The bar for efficacy and safety has not changed, whether for aducanumab or any other drug. And the accelerated approval pathway is a tried and true. Without that pathway, we would not have several drugs on the market that are currently bringing enormous benefit to patients. And I want to bring up one in particular, one area, which is oncology, in which the accelerated approval pathway has been repeatedly used over time to benefit patients and get drugs to patients as quickly as possible. And again, not undermining, not accepting evidence in any lesser form to inform FDA's approval decisions. And so just want to make sure that the bar for those are never lowered in any way. And I speak with some experience in this because I'm actually a cancer patient benefiting from the same drugs that have been approved previously by the FDA under similar pathways. So I just wanted to make that clear that the accelerated approval pathway is a tried and true, and it's been used multiple times in multiple other therapeutic areas.
Gotcha. Any thoughts, Steve? Did you want to take a crack at this?
Yeah, Sean. So, I think the accelerated approval pathway is a very important tool that the FDA has. I think this particular approval was different than most. Historically, we've never had an advisory board that was universally against the approval. And so, I don't know how Wendy feels about this, but this one seems different, especially for those of us on the payer side who are trying to evaluate this. And the only other point I'd like to make is that, when you have clear biology, then surrogate endpoints probably make more sense. When the biology is still being worked out, then the surrogate endpoints become a little squishier. And then when you add the size of the population, any error we make is going to be not only potentially harmful for patients, but also expensive for society. So I think this becomes extremely complicated, especially as we move forward for products that affect so many people. The cancer products tend to have smaller populations. And so, the others people on this panel are much better at health technology assessment than myself, but this one seems a lot different.
Yeah. I know, Wendy, you came off mute, so you probably have some comments on that. I just want, just as a kind of a guiding point, I'm hoping we probably won't spend too much time on this panel kind of debating the specifics about, this approval. Although obviously that's the elephant in the room. But Steve, I think as you're pointing out is, there are, differences of view about the scientific uncertainty in this particular case, but it's a more general, my sense is it's a more general concern, or I don't know, concern, issue, challenge from the kind of the perspective of the folks like yourself and Brian and Nicholas that have to, after the regulatory approval, make the decisions about for whom it should be paid for and under what conditions, et cetera. So Brian, did you have some reflections on this?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'd rather we didn't focus too much on the aducanumab issue, as Steve mentioned, it was different, and you mentioned the controversy associated with it. And if we focus just on that, it's probably going to cloud our discussion on the real issue here, which is the accelerated pathways that all regulators are using, not just the FDA, and the uncertainty at market launch, and how, as an HTA or a payer, we're addressing that or dealing with that uncertainty, because payers still believe in providing early and equitable access to these promising technologies. But how do we do that and continue to manage the affordability or the budget impact of these technologies? And I think that's the key issue that we'd like to address today in the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to hear Nicholas weigh in just to add on this, but then actually I do want to kind of fairly quickly come back to precisely what you just raised, Brian, which is what are some of the promising ways of thinking about this from a reimbursement market access perspective about these situations that kind of get that right balance of access, particularly for where there's huge unmet need and despite uncertainty, et cetera. Like what are some of the things that are looking like tools or mechanisms that actually have some promise to kind of square that circle? So Nicholas, some thoughts here?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's obvious that these different kinds of accelerated access, irrespective of the regulatory agency and the name of the pathway, gains a common understanding also from HTA payers. Of course, we realize that there is no use with drug development if the patients have to die waiting for the evidence, to put it blunt. On the other hand, and I will never say that the regulatory question is easy, but it seems easier still than the HTA question. You have to answer questions: is it safe? Is it good? Is it safe? HTAs needs to answer the questions: how good is it? Is it better than the alternatives? And how much better? And I would say the reason probably why we are also in this panel with different backgrounds and different perspectives is that there is an increasing acknowledgement among very different therapeutic areas that to really get true patient access to new innovations, you need to combine the needs and the reasons for every stakeholder. And I think it's also fair to say that if you look at the challenges we have to tackle together, at least half of them going from idea to true patient access are after first regulatory approval. So we really have to have this discussion, and affordability is one of the questions, but also evidence needs are different when you have to put it in relation to what's already on the market. And you might then say, but this is the first in class. Yes, sometimes there's really nothing else to give, but also for first-in-class agents, there might be a relevant comparator. So there is a common in ground, deep down, a very good understanding for the accelerated pathways, but we need to inform also the regulators more about our needs, I think, from the HTAs.
Nicholas is so right. The approval by the regulator is just what I would call the start of the process. I mean, we still have to capture information because the clinical trials that are conducted in order to inform a regulatory decision is on a limited number of patients. And once you have the drug on the market, now you have the ability and the capacity to capture, larger volumes of data from patients who are actually using the drug to determine the clinical benefit and to help inform, HTA decisions, which should be going on over time. And so the topic of this discussion, Sean, to my understanding, is how do we capture these real world data to be able to inform not just HTA decisions, but also decisions by regulators for future drugs that may be coming up in the pipeline and that are currently under development, but also for family members, for clinicians. If we get to the point, and I'm really hoping that over time we will, where we have several drugs on the market, several disease-modifying drugs on the market for Alzheimer's, how can a clinician decide which drug for which patient? And the only way we can tell that is by capturing more data. And in this case, in addition to the clinical trials that are used for regulatory decision-making, capturing it in the real world so that we can have patient experience data on how patients are feeling and functioning with the drugs, long term. And so that the only way we can continuously learn from these drugs that are on the market to inform HTA decisions is by capturing these real world data.
Yeah, well, great, Wendy. I appreciate that, because that obviously is where we're hoping this panel discussion is heading. with the idea that, just as you described, the ability to capture real world data after the introduction of new technologies, drugs, et cetera, particularly for which there's significant uncertainty, important uncertainties at the time of product launch, is a critical tool to discuss. And, and maybe again, for purposes of, using the case study of Alzheimer's and aducanumab as a sort of a jumping off point, whatever you think about the approval, the drug has been approved. And while it's still unclear exactly how quickly it will be adopted, there's some reasonable likelihood that it will gradually be adopted. But let's just take the point then of, okay, let's say there's going to be some utilization of aducanumab and other drugs going through accelerated approval. I would love to hear more perspectives on the sort of potential and challenges of real world data, real world evidence as a way of addressing this. And Steve, do you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, so Sean, and Alzheimer's is a great use case, because when you think about what really makes a difference for the patient and what really makes a difference for the caregivers is their activity of daily living. And so if you can actually keep someone at home, out of clinics, hospitals, and doctors' offices, and as you know, the number one reason people get institutionalized with Alzheimer's is actually toileting. And so if you actually had data about these types of activities, regardless of what's happening to their amyloid plaques, you would actually, as a payer, be thrilled to sponsor that product, because it would be actually making a difference in the lives of those patients and their caregivers. And so I actually think the incorporation of real world data even into the approval process is going to be crucial, because it doesn't matter if you look at aducanumab or one of the other monoclonal antibodies coming to the marketplace. We are going to have treatments for this disease in the near future, which is great, but we also want to know their impact as far as quality of life. And right now, we too frequently don't grab enough of that data.
Okay, so you're really emphasizing the potential for real world data to reflect kind of a broader range of outcomes that are important to patients and family members with Alzheimer's disease, that perhaps is not as easily obtainable through clinical trials, or hasn't been included in trials. Is that kind of the main point you're making, Steve?
That's correct. And so I think that incorporating that, and we meet with the pharmaceutical manufacturers early on, because we're trying to emphasize to them, these are the types of things that the payer community actually really wants to be able to reimburse for. So, to be very frank, I've never had one of the employers come to me and say, I need a drug that decreases amyloid plaque. What they come to me is they're asking for drugs that actually will keep patients in the home, functioning, even on the work site, for as long as possible.
Right.
Can I just say that, Steve, if I could just make one quick comment to Steve. Steve, you are a payer speaking like a true regulator, I have to say, because your description of what you'd like to capture in order to make your decisions on reimbursement actually embodies the definition of patient experience data. What is meaningful to patients? What are their preferences? Essentially, when they are in therapeutic intervention, regardless of the drug, are they seeing clinical benefit? Are they seeing impact on their outcomes that are measurable to them and their families? So what you've just described is exactly the type of data that I'm hoping that we'll continue to collect. And regardless of the points on which these data, the flow comes in, we'll have obviously capturing multiple inputs. So clinical data when you have your doctor's visits, but also data at home captured, patient reported outcomes and observer reported outcomes, capturing all of those into let's say a platform that can facilitate analysis and then be able to give outputs for payers to make their decisions, for regulators to make their decisions, for clinicians to make their decisions, and then for family members. If you put a patient, and let's say in the future we have multiple drugs, you have your family member on drug A, and over time you realize that that drug isn't working, you ought to have data to inform whether they should be switched to another drug. It's the same thing that we do in oncology all the time. If you don't see the tumor size shrinking, or you're having, then you need to switch the patient. You don't keep the patient on the drug when it's not working. And it's the same scenario that we need to build, getting these patient experience data and these real world data to inform those types of decisions across all stakeholders.
Right. Brian, some thoughts on this?
Yeah, Wendy's just made some really excellent points there. And I wanted to take maybe just a step back from focusing just on real world data, because to me, that's just one tool in a broader approach that we've been starting to take with the assessment of these technologies going through an accelerated approval process. Accelerated approval creates uncertainty for all stakeholders, from the patient to the clinician, the payer, the HTA body, the regulators. So in the HTA community, we've been thinking about this for a number of years, and we're starting to promote a new approach called health technology management, which deals with horizon scanning and early knowledge of what's coming in the pipelines, doing scientific dialogue, early dialogue with manufacturers, pre-phase 2, pre-phase 3, many of those being done jointly with the regulator. So we have a better understanding of what's coming, how the trials are being done, is there any innovation in those trials, et cetera. And then focusing in on broader engagement with stakeholders, particularly with patients and clinicians, understanding what are the outcomes that are really, truly important and meaningful to patients. Thirdly is taking this broader life cycle approach to the assessment of technologies, pre-market, on-market, post-market, with real-world data, a reassessment. These are all really important from a decision maker's perspective. And then lastly, getting involved with implementation, both at the practice level and the policy level, evidence-based implementation to support good, sound decision-making, pricing decisions, et cetera. So that's kind of the approach we've been taking, and real-world data, real-world evidence is a key component, but just one component of this broader approach.
Yeah, great. And Brian, just before we go to Nicholas, because I know you have some interesting reflections on this as well. Just, because in this panel and in the pre-read, we've been thinking a lot about how the real world evidence, real world data kind of contributes to this and that entire broader framework or set of tools that you talked about, Brian. Can you say anything specific about, experience with positive or negative with real world data as a way of addressing the fundamental uncertainties that exist at the time of product approval? Like, how are there some examples or the lessons learned in terms of how to do that or not to do that as you've gained through your experience?
Well, not just my experience, but through some of the interaction that I've had with payers and the global community. One of the roles that I mentioned that I play at ISPOR is chair of their HTA Council. And ISPOR held a payer summit in 2020 on real world evidence, and it involved companies as well as payers, mostly from Canada and the United States at that time. And then we followed that up in 2021 with a payer summit on performance-based contracting, very closely linked to real world evidence. And there's just so many barriers to the expanded use of real world data in decision making. And one of the key challenges is at the payer level, they're just so busy with getting into contracts, managing contracts. They've got so much data. The data is spread out all over the place, that the capacity and the knowledge to do something or to make better decisions with that data is creating such a significant barrier. So we do have to provide or look for some tools or processes that will facilitate the review of that real world data. One of the other things that ISPOR has done recently in conjunction with the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, Duke Margolis, and the National Pharmaceutical Council is we've just launched an RWE registry. So to promote transparency, a simplified process for registering your RWE study, so you don't have to do the complicated clinicaltrials.gov. It's open access. There'll be some trust associated with it. So just these types of tools and processes, I think, will go a long way to supporting everybody from using real world data.
Are the panel members allowed to ask other panel members questions? I have a question for Brian. I really enjoyed listening to what he had to say.
I just want to hear from Nicholas first, and then Wendy, you can ask Brian all the questions you want.
Okay, thank you, Sean. First, I want to make a disclaimer. I'm not saying this as a representative for TLV or UNETA 21. This is my reflections after having spoken to a lot of people, some of them the same as Brian over the years. And I think Brian was completely right describing the big picture. I'll try to put it down to 3 points on real world data. One on any real world data, I would say, also linking to Brian, one more focused, and the third one probably quite focused on Alzheimer's. But Brian, I think what you say is that we have seen a lot of efforts to collect real world data. And my impression is that that's true, but we have seen too few successes when we're looking back. So I would like to use an analogy, actually today for the first time. I think real world data is somehow like in Swedish folklore, we have something we call an evil fairy that we call the wooden raw. She is very beautiful looking at from the front side, but hideous from the backside, covered with the bark. I think we must manage real world data in a way, because we have seen so many examples where we sit down and the only way forward is to decide we must gather real world evidence, real world data. But when we meet again 5 years later, it might be difficult to conclude on what's the worth of those data. How can we allow that to influence our decision making? So that's the first point. The second point is that I think tremendously important for any kind of use for real world data will be that we have a solid base of historical data sets, longitudinal data. We must know what will happen with the disease without treatment. And that is, then I need to come back to my Swedish and European standpoint. We have no drugs registered for this disease, for Alzheimer's, yet. We are still in a position where we can collect much more historical data sets. I hope we can use the time we have to do that. It is already now more difficult in the US. I hope it's still possible, but it's already now, when we have the first agent on the market, more difficult, because we need to relate to something. And that puts me down to my third point. With Alzheimer's, we are actually looking for, not for improvement, but absence of decrease, of functioning decrease. And that makes it even more difficult, everything we look for. I think we must try to use real world data, both from electronic health records, where we collect basic data on everyone, and specified disease registers, where we collect more detailed data on a few patients. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm thinking on that last point, Nicholas, kind of, reminding me of something that Steve said early on in terms of the kinds of patient outcomes and caregiver measures and the sorts of things that are meaningful in terms of the experience of patients and reflecting the effectiveness of therapies. Those are not going to be immediately available in historical data or electronic health record data, but I guess we could all agree it would be a good time. The time to start collecting that kind of information systematically was yesterday or last year, but the best option available to us now is to try to put in place mechanisms to collect it as well as possible going forward. So Wendy, you had a question for Brian.
Actually, I just wanted to say, Nicholas and Brian and Steve made such excellent points. I just wanted to follow up on one of them. I love the analogy, by the way, Nicholas, this evil fairy. And it makes me think of, at the end of the day, we want to assess the response to therapy. We want to know, to answer Steve's question, how are these patients benefiting in their real day-to-day lives from this or any other drug that might come on the market? And we have to be confident, we have to be able to collect in a rigorous manner the type of data that we need, both the quality and the quantity need to be there in these data, so that everyone, the stakeholders at the end, whether you're an HTA, whether you're a payer, whether you're a regulator, whether you're a clinician, or whether you're a sponsor, because they are investing tens and hundreds of millions into these drugs. They want to know whether these drugs are working and whether they need to improve on them and innovate on them. And so if you take those 4 major buckets of stakeholders, they all need to be confident in the outcomes of whatever data analysis that's done with real world data. And I really appreciate the comments that Steve and Nicholas and Brian made in terms of, we have to capture these data in real time. We have to set up parameters on how these data are going to be captured, the rigor of collection, of annotation and analysis, to be able to get the output so that all the stakeholders can be confident in what comes out. And honestly, we need to start somewhere, and so that we don't have that evil fairy at the end of the day, after we collect all these data for all those years and we find out, oh my gosh, it's not usable, it's not interoperable, it made no sense collecting them. If we start doing it correctly to begin with, then at the end of the day, we'll have good outcomes on which to base our decisions.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. And Brian, did you want to respond to any of that?
Maybe just very quickly, again, great points by Wendy here. The data that we collect does need to be meaningful from a patient perspective, and it needs to be measurable so that we can actually do something with it.
Yeah.
And I need to add there, and they, at the end of the collection time, they need to be trusted by all partners, all parties, irrespective of if they are in terms positive or negative for their own sake. And that's where we have the clue, I think.
Yeah. So maybe a good place to go with this is to kind of hone in a little bit specifically around what we've been trying to do with Us Against Alzheimer's and a kind of an expert work group, which is we've been working on what we're calling a real world evidence framework for Alzheimer's disease. And I sent you all a kind of a brief overview of what that's about. But the notion is that, you know, if in fact we all agree that it's important to collect high quality, consistent, valid real world data on patients with Alzheimer's disease, ideally whether or not they're being treated, that it would be good to identify a set of sort of specifications or requirements or sort of technical requirements about what that data should look like, or those data platforms should look like, so that it actually has the capacity to collect the right outcomes, answer the correct questions, and, you know, have appropriate governance and you know, rules about data sharing, et cetera. And so without going into a lot of the details of the framework, I'm just interested in any reflections you have about you know, the elements that we've included in that framework that I just described, or any other characteristics that we ought to be trying to make sure of, that as we go forward in the US in the context of Alzheimer's treatments, what should be in a framework? What should be a set of specifications to make sure we kind of get it right?
Hey, Sean, let me start real quick. And that is, Wendy hit on something very hard early on, and that is taking into account the patient and the family's considerations. So when you think of Alzheimer's and you think of the heterogeneity of the people that get Alzheimer's, we have to have systems that actually can be used not just by sophisticated families, but by families without the same means. And so simplicity is going to be crucial. And so finding measures that are simple that families can actually accurately record. And so I think involving families and involving the caregivers that are taking care of those patients and their providers. And when I talk about providers, I'm thinking more globally than just the physicians. I'm talking about the physical therapists, the occupational therapists, and others, the behavioral counselors that are providing care for these patients, because this is really where you unlock the key to finding where these things are making clinical differences and but it has to be simple and usable.
Super. Wendy, any advice on this or?
Steve, I almost felt like you were speaking directly to me on that. When I was taking care of my father, there came a time when he didn't even know what day it was. And so I realized, you know, honestly, that giving him a calendar and saying, Dad, please check off on the days that you took your medicine when he couldn't even remember what day it was a futile thing. And so I so agree with you. It has to be in a way that is simply enough for multiple families. We know that this is a disease that, you know, doesn't just affect the rich and the educated, but it affects all of us across the board. So making it simple, making it manageable. It's a huge burden on these families because many of them, it got to the point where, you know, I was parenting my parent and many of us are facing that. And so we're all managing full-time jobs and children, and we have to make it simple. So couldn't agree with you more. In terms of what some of the specifications are, Sean, you asked that question. I think whatever platform, whatever means by which we use to capture these data need to be flexible enough so that as we learn, as science progresses, as we get new biomarkers and new measures of really figuring out how these drugs, how are we going to assess response to therapy for these various drugs, that platform ought to be flexible enough to accommodate the science as we're progressing. So new biomarkers that we will ultimately discover should be able to be incorporated into that in real time so that the analysis subsequently can produce the outcomes that all the stakeholders can be confident in. So that's my 2 cents.
Brian, any advice for us on this framework concept or technical specifications or how to get it right?
Yeah, two concepts, and then maybe just a quick story. I really like the fact that your framework focuses a lot on engaging with patients and caregivers to understand really what is important to them. I think that will be a part of your success in moving this framework forward. I'd also just go back to the RWE registry to build transparency, to build trust and cooperation in the research, to enter your studies into some form of a registry. And if you want to use the ISPOR-ISPI one, that would be great. Then the story. Last week, I had the opportunity to participate or actually to observe a panel presentation at a conference, and it was entitled, "Is Canada Ready to Embrace the Opportunities Presented by Emerging Technologies in the Field of Alzheimer's and Related Dementias?" And there was a patient, a family physician, and 3 neurologists who actually treat patients and are involved in some of the research. It was really interesting that they focused in a lot on the diagnostic challenges that we really underdiagnose, overdiagnose, misdiagnose completely. And most of that is because there's not a lot of tools available for family doctors who are the first contact with some of the patients that present with memory challenges. But what really impressed me was that they said, let's not just focus in on the emerging therapies. Despite the fact that there was a lot of excitement of these potential new breakthrough therapies, but they said there was a need for a comprehensive and proper care pathway for the treatment of Alzheimer's patients, from the preclinical stage through to the mild cases to full Alzheimer's, and a comprehensive checklist for use by the family physicians. And that to me was an important message, that these therapies need to be embedded within an overarching care pathway.
Yeah, great point. And Nicholas, we're going to give you the last word. Any final comments on this or any other aspects of the discussion?
I think that what I've seen from your framework is very good, and I agree. I mean, we must start with the patients. Still, even patient-reported outcomes need to be compared. That's at the end of the day, we need to be able to compare with something, meaning those that didn't get the treatment, especially when it's registered on early data. So I come back to historical data sets as often as you can, and an ability and a willingness to combine different data sets. So if you have electronic health data records, it might be from other countries. I know we are fortunate there in Sweden. We must use those, and then for the information we don't have in those broad registries, we might use other registries on more specific base to get the information we need.
Yeah.
And I think we need to see investments in data for the common good. And that might be difficult to get those money on the table, but we need to see people invest in things that they know their competitors will be able to use as well to get out of this corner. Thank you.
Right. Well, I would just want to thank you all for a fantastic discussion, really thoughtful points, and quite helpful, I think, to the work that Russ and George Radenberg and others at Us Against Alzheimer's are trying to move forward in this space. I think your comments have really been encouraging in terms of it's challenging to move this forward for all sorts of reasons, but also critically important to do so. So really appreciate your taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you.